Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our present discussion is about United Nations peacekeeping operations. United Nations peacekeeping operations have turned out to be the most effective activities of the World Organization, United Nations, in preventing and moderating international conflicts. In the contemporary era, in the contemporary politics, in the era of nuclear weapons, international peacekeeping has acted as a most valuable instrument of conflict control by isolating any international conflict from great powers' involvement. As the United Nations lacks necessary political and military capabilities to undertake peace enforcement, the concept of keeping conforms better than collective security to the requirements of post-war international power politics. The United Nations Charter contains The United Nations Charter contains no reference or official definition of the peacekeeping concept, but it has acquired a common usage in describing United Nations military activities during the past many decades. The concept of peacekeeping is open to a variety of different definitions. I have already explained you terminologies and peacekeeping and peacemaking and preventive diplomacy, and different writers of different fields of international relations, international organizations explained their own views about peacekeeping operations in maintaining or protecting international peace. United Nations peacekeeping refers to operations in which personnel owing allegiance to the United Nations are engaged in a military or paramilitary duties and or are carrying weapon for their own defense in the pursuit of duties designated by the United Nations as necessary for the maintenance or restoration of peace. The objects of the United Nations peacekeeping have been the prevention, containment, moderation, and termination of hostilities between or within states through the medium of peaceful third-party intervention organized and directed internationally. Unlike any national army in action, the United Nations peacekeeping force has no enemies and it does not align itself with either of the contending parties. It may serve as a force of international force of interposition, as did United Nations emergency forces in Suez Canal crisis, or as a force employed to prevent communal fighting and to resort and maintaining law and order as the United Nations forces has done in Cyprus. In this regard, Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld played leading role towards the growth and consolidation of peacekeeping operation. It may be conceived as an interim measure to contain the area of conflict and to hold the line until the negotiable settlement of dispute can be achieved. The peacekeeping operation intends to assist the states to avoid dangerous confrontations. The peacekeeping function of international organization is peculiarly appropriate to such an era as our own, a period of global competition between two superpowers, of proliferation of new states with different urgent aspirations to maintain and assert their independence, and of universal acknowledgement of desperate need to avoid a general war that would fully demonstrate for the first and perhaps for the last time destructive potential of different nuclear weapons. The very feature of the contemporary international system and situation that make collective security irrelevant bolster the relevance of peacekeeping. The peacekeeping operation representing the most speculator's institutional development of the United Nations in the post-war era must be differentiated from the enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the Charter. It involves more peaceful intervention with the consent of the parties directly involved in the dispute. Now, Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld, in his summary study of 1958, he had outlined the basic nature of peacekeeping operation. The operation being non-coercive by nature is conducted in an impartial way, the states having special interest in the conflict situations and the permanent members of the Security Council are generally excluded from the mission. The United Nations has employed peace observation missions in Greece 1947, Palestine 1948, Indonesia 1948, Kashmir 1948, and Lebanon 1958. The force level peacekeeping operations have been deployed in the Middle East in 1956 and 1973, in Congo 1960, and in Cyprus 1964. The use of military observer mission was not evolved in accordance with any pre-planned design. Initially, government representative of member states had served in the observer missions on United Nations Commission, and all expenses charged for the missions were shared by respective governments. Subsequently, it was resolved that observers should act as impartial representatives of the United Nations, and they played their very important role, and travel and substance allowances of the mission would be charged on the United Nations budget. Such activities considered very important regarding the maintaining, keeping, and making peace. The United Nations observer groups in Indonesia and Kashmir had set the pattern for subsequent observer missions. In each of the two cases, the Secretary General decided, in consultation with the parties to the dispute, which state would be requested to provide military observers. The Secretary General had also appointed the head of the observer mission, who should act as international civil servant directly responsible to him. The United Nations observers were entitled to certain privileges and immunities. As the Secretariat took on more support responsibilities, improved its performance, and substituted itself for national sources, it progressively became the centralized coordinator and manager of field missions. This gradual evolution left a lasting imprint on peacekeeping. The United Nations military action in Korea in early 1950s cannot be listed within the United Nations peacekeeping operation. The United Nations launched its first peacekeeping operation in the Middle East following the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956. In 1960, a more elaborate and complicated operation was undertaken in Congo. The United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in Palestine and the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan had been established in 1948, and they are played their very important role. The United Nations Observer Group in Lebanon was deployed as an arms control, fact-finding and reporting mission. The United Nations Temporary Executive Authority was also employed in West Iran to conduct the administration of the territory, and the authority carried on responsibility successfully for 8 months. During the late 1950s and 1960s, the United Nations had conducted its main peacekeeping operation in areas which were formerly under the colonial rule. The United Nations peacekeeping missions have undertaken multidimensional activities, including supervision of election in Korea 1949 and West New Guinea in 1969, supervision of arms control and relief services. The United Nations peacekeeping operations in the Middle East and Congo were subject to wide controversy. Both United Nations emergency forces and United Nations Commission were financed through voluntary contributions and assessments by the General Assembly. Subsequently, a number of members refused to pay these assessments, involving the United Nations into precarious financial crisis. The Assembly had sought the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the question whether the expenditures it has authorized for United Nations emergency forces constituted expenses of the organization within the meaning of the Article 17. The court recognized the authority of the General Assembly for conducting peacekeeping operations on the basis of the provisions of Article of the Charter of the United Nations, Article 1, 5, 6, 11, 14, 17, 18 and 22 of the Charter. After the publication of International Court of Justice affirmative opinion, many members paid their arrears and France and Soviet Union had sharply opposed the delegation of wide executive authority to the Secretary General for conducting any peacekeeping operation authorized by the United Nations. They had protested against the Secretary General's role and initiative behind the creation of different United Nations missions and United Nations operations, peacekeeping operations. After a bitter experience of Congo operation, the United Nations had moved more cautiously in assuming new responsibilities. The Secretary General insisted that responsible assurance in advance should be maintained to cover the additional expenditures of United Nations peacekeeping operations. The parties involved in the West Iran and Yemen crisis agreed to share the cost of United Nations peacekeeping missions. In the case of Cyprus, the Secretary General was assured that the cost would be borne by members through voluntary contributions. So, during the Arab Israeli War of October 1973, all major powers except China conceded that the cost of new United Nations Emergency Force, estimated at $30 million for the first 6 months, was to be regarded as expenses to be borne by the members as appropriated by the General Assembly. So, overall, controversy associated with the international peacekeeping expenditures among superpowers and among other members of the United States remain also a bitter reality in this regard. While discussing about the United Nations peacekeeping forces, the great majority of the member states supported General Assembly's right to initiate and direct such operations in the event of a deadlock in the Security Council. It is worth recalling that about two-fifths of the United Nations member states have extended official help. Many of them have contributed many aspects. For example, manpower, furnished equipments, extended airlift and sea lift services, and offer base facilities to promote international peacekeeping sponsored by the United Nations. Some of those missions have been financed out of regular United Nations budget through the consent of the majority of member states. United Nations General Assembly had authorized its president to set up a special committee on peacekeeping operation to undertake a comprehensive review of all problems relating to the peacekeeping operation. This point is very important, and this was a very important development in this regard. 18th February in 18th February 1965, General Assembly had authorized its president to set up a special committee on peacekeeping operation to undertake a comprehensive review of all problems relating to the peacekeeping operations and to devise plan for future missions. Basic purpose of this special committee was to maintain and to promote peacekeeping efficient more effective activities under the United Nations. The Special Committee and the General Assembly have continued their efforts to formulate guidelines and principles for future peacekeeping operations. Most of the problems associated with international peacekeeping are highly political by nature and must be dealt with on an ad hoc manner in the light of the specific circumstances of the situation. The mandates establishing peacekeeping operation must especially clarify the objectives of the missions and obligations of the member states, the privileges, immunities, and rights of the missions have to be codified precisely. In respect of termination of mission, the United Nations must obtain a firm agreement for advance notification and consultation in the event of a party to the dispute wanted the mission to be withdrawn. The initial decisions regarding the size and type of mission have direct influence on such crucial problems as securing host state, consent, contingent contributions, airlift, logistics support, and financial backing. The size and structure of peace observation mission and peacekeeping forces should be constantly reviewed in relation to progress in peacemaking. In most cases, the United Nations failed to organize and thereby to provide logistic support for peacekeeping operation, as has been clearly stated by different writers that past peacekeeping and peace observation operations do not seem in many cases to have obtained as much as their logistical requirements from the host states or concerned parties as they could and should have. The United Nations peacekeeping policies have been influenced by the specific circumstances of the situation and not by any pre planned assumptions. Thus, different proposals for the establishment of a permanent United Nations force had been rejected in the past. The member states have only accepted ad hoc arrangements to deal with a specific crisis situation. In every conflict, the nature of the crisis and not the theory of anonymity sets the course of action by the United Nations. The UN has failed to undertake peacekeeping operations in disputes involving direct confrontations between superpowers and crises emerging directly within the American or Soviet Union's influence. The Berlin and Cuban Missile Crisis disputes between Argentina and conflict between different other states can be easily traced out in this regard. Many disputes in different Asian and African countries remained unresolved due to the politics of superpowers. The future of international peacekeeping is still clouded with doubts and uncertain situations. There also exists a very little possibility of any doctoral expansion of the United Nations peacekeeping into a more activist, independent, and more precise policies for the attainment of the basic purposes of peacekeeping and peacemaking. While concluding this topic, it can be explained that United Nations peacekeeping activities will depend to a great extent upon superpowers' role. The peacekeeping consensus may be gravely complicated and become serious due to adverse trends, threatening trends of major powers in the functioning of the United Nations. Peacekeeping idea evolving over many decades reached an important threshold. The Soviet Union has extended and explicit support after years of de facto toleration and has not opposed to peacekeeping missions sponsored through the consent of the majority members. Recently, both America and Soviet Union reached agreements on many principles underlying the peacekeeping idea, although they have failed to resolve differences on many other important issues. The United Nations peacekeeping operations may play a very important role in maintaining peace and to remove the threatening situations, to remove conflicts, and to become more supportive for the betterment of world peace and security and for the promotion of peace and security in different part of the world, not only in different parts of the world but overall on global level. United Nations peacekeeping and peacemaking activities can be analyzed very easily because one point is very clear that effective arrangements to keep the peace by international cooperation continue from past to the present because United Nations Charter promoted world peace and security through different methods, through different approaches, and particularly post Cold War era and post Second World War era indicated a complex situation in world politics. The complexity of the process of keeping the peace has been made even greater by different new methods, different new media of propaganda, and different new trends in diplomacy and new means of communication and through social media, through net, and through uh, vast new trends in communications. So, overall, peace always remained a basic purpose, not only in state level but also in global level. United Nations as international organization, as a world organization, playing its effective role, but sometimes many hurdles faced to this organization due to the ideological, strategic, defense, security interest, political interest of member states, because every state promoted its own national interest, and clash of interest create different hurdles to achieve basic purposes of peace and security. In spite of many financial problems, political problems, uh, role of superpowers, controversy among superpowers. In spite of all these problems, United Nations peacekeeping, peacemaking, and preventive diplomacy is playing very effective and efficient role in present period in different parts of the world, because through this process peace can be maintained and achieved in a proper way. And that is the end of this discussion.